52 minutes of waiting at Celeste, the city's most expensive restaurant. 4 times the waiter circled back with pitying eyes. Then her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. I can't do this anymore. You're a great person, but I need someone who understands my ambitions. Take care. If you can't stand people who abandon you through a text, let me know in the comments. Type "nobody deserves that." Because what happened next changed everything. She was gathering her purse with trembling hands, blinking back the tears that would absolutely destroy the mascara she'd applied so carefully in the car mirror, when a voice cut through the fog of her humiliation like a lifeline she hadn't known she needed. I am so sorry I'm late. The voice was deep, confident, completely unfamiliar. She looked up into the face of a man she'd never seen before, dark eyes that seemed to actually see her instead of through her, perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, the kind of commanding presence that made nearby conversations pause mid-sentence as heads turned to see who had just arrived. He slid into Marcus's empty seat across from her, like he'd been expected all along, like they'd planned this exact moment, like he belonged there at her table more than the man who'd abandoned her ever had. Before she could speak, before she could tell him he had the wrong table, or that she was leaving, or that this was some kind of mistake, he leaned forward with an urgency that stopped the words in her throat. "Play along," he said quietly enough that only she could hear, his voice carrying a conviction that felt like solid ground beneath her feet. "Please, just for a few minutes." His eyes flicked down to her phone, still glowing with Marcus's cowardly text message on the white tablecloth between them, then back to her face with an intensity that made her heart stutter. He doesn't get to leave you looking like this. Not here. Not in front of all these people who've been watching you wait for almost an hour. Not when you're clearly someone worth showing up for. There was something in his expression, something raw and understanding, like he knew exactly what this kind of abandonment felt like he'd lived his own version of being made to feel invisible. "Give me 5 minutes," he continued, his voice softer now. "And then you can tell me to leave. You can walk out of here with your head high. But right now, every single person in this restaurant thinks you've been stood up. And I think you deserve better than carrying that memory for the rest of your life." Something in the way he looked at her, not with pity like the waiter, not with curiosity like the other diners, but with something that felt almost like recognition, made her nod. Just barely. Just enough for him to settle back in his chair and signal to the waiter with a kind of casual authority that suggested he did this sort of thing all the time. He ordered wine like he owned the vineyard it came from, his voice carrying just enough warmth to transform the waiter's pitying expression into something closer to intrigue. When the same waiter who'd been apologetically hovering over her empty table for the past hour approached with menus, the stranger smiled with a genuine ease and said, "We'll start with the tasting menu, and bring us your best Bordeaux. We have a lot to celebrate tonight." The waiter's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Suddenly, they weren't pathetic. She wasn't pathetic. They were intriguing, worth paying attention to, the kind of couple that belonged in a place like Celestine. As soon as they were alone again, the stranger extended his hand across the table with a slight smile that crinkled the corners of his dark eyes. "I'm Dominic, and before you ask, no, I don't make a habit of crashing strangers' disasters or inserting myself into moments that aren't mine. But I was sitting at the bar over there, nursing a drink I didn't really want after a business dinner that ended badly. And I saw you sitting here. I watched you check your phone. I saw your face when you read that text. And I saw you trying so hard not to cry in front of all these people, and I just... He paused, his hands still extended between them, something vulnerable flickering across his features before he continued. I know what it feels like to be made small by someone who should make you feel infinite. I know what it's like to sit somewhere expensive and feel completely worthless despite everything around you suggesting otherwise. She placed her hand in his, and his grip was warm and steady in a way that made something tight in her chest finally loosen. The first course arrived moments later, something delicate and artistic that she knew cost a small fortune, but barely registered beyond its beauty on the plate. They talked, not the performative kind of talking she'd grown used to with Marcus, where every conversation felt like an audition for his approval, but actual genuine conversation where words flowed like they'd known each other longer than 5 minutes. He asked what she did, leaning forward with real interest. And when she said she was a restoration artist at the City Museum, that she spent her days bringing damaged paintings back to life with careful hands and patient hours, his eyes lit up like she'd said something profound instead of ordinary. "That's incredible," he said, and he meant it. "You take things people have given up on, things that are broken or faded or forgotten, and you bring them back to themselves. That's not just a job, that's necessary magic." Marcus used to call her work cute in that dismissive tone that made her feel small. Dominic called it magic and looked at her like he genuinely wanted to understand every detail. She asked what brought him to Celestine on a Thursday night, and his expression shifted into something more guarded. Business dinner that ended earlier than expected. Sometimes it's exhausting being what everyone expects you to be, playing the role, saying the right things, pretending the success matters more than the connection. There was something deeply lonely in the way he said it, something that made her forget they were strangers playing pretend for an audience that was slowly losing interest in their table now that the drama had resolved itself into normalcy. It was during the third course, some kind of perfectly seared fish that melted on the tongue, when curiosity finally got the better of her. She pulled out her phone under the table, keeping it low and out of sight, and typed his first name into the search bar. What came up made her breath stop completely in her lungs. Dominic Vale, CEO of Vale Industries, Forbes under 30, 3 years running. Net worth with so many commas, she had to count them twice to believe what she was seeing. Photos of him at charity galas, board meetings, standing next to politicians and celebrities like it was the most normal thing in the world. She looked up slowly, her heart hammering, and found him watching her with something like resignation settling over his features. "You figured it out," he said quietly, setting down his fork with careful precision. It wasn't a question. She nodded, suddenly hyper-aware of the vast distance between their worlds, the impossibility of this moment, the ridiculousness of someone like him sitting across from someone like her in her 3-month saving stress, having a conversation like they were equals. "I should go," she whispered, already starting to gather her things again for the second time tonight. "You should stay," he countered. And there was something almost pleading in his voice that made her pause. He reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching hers, like he was giving her the choice of whether to close that final distance. "I didn't sit down because you needed saving. I don't have some hero complex or savior fantasy. I sat down because I watched you hold yourself together for 52 minutes with such dignity and grace, refusing to cry, despite how much it clearly hurt. And that's not weakness. That's the kind of strength most people spend their whole lives trying to find. He paused, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the expensive restaurants fade into background noise. And he's going to regret losing you. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but someday he's going to realize that he had someone extraordinary and he let her go because he was too small-minded to see it. The words hit her like a physical force, settling into the hollow places Marcus's text had carved out. "Come with me," Dominic said, standing and extending his hand with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested he was used to people saying yes, but hoping desperately that she would. "Let me show you that tonight doesn't have to be about what he took from you. It can be about what you're about to discover about yourself." She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment that stretched between heartbeats. Then she placed her hand in his and let him pull her to her feet. His penthouse was something out of a magazine she'd never been able to afford. Floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city like he owned every light sprawling below them. Furniture that looked like art installations. Space that echoed with the kind of emptiness that money couldn't quite fill. He poured wine from a bottle that probably cost more than her monthly rent, the label in French, with the year that suggested it was older than she was. And they migrated naturally to the terrace, where the wind pulled at her carefully styled hair and made her feel like she was flying above the world instead of drowning in it. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" he asked, staring out at the city he probably owned significant pieces of. His hands gripped the railing with enough force that his knuckles went white. "Like you checked all the right boxes, achieved all the things you were supposed to achieve, climbed every ladder people put in front of you, and then you got to the top and realized you're completely alone up there. That success looks nothing like you thought it would when you were fighting for it." She thought about Marcus, about how she'd spent 3 years trying to fold herself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit into his life, his plans, his vision of what their future should look like, shrinking her dreams so they wouldn't overshadow his ambitions, making herself less so he could feel like more. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I spent so long trying to be enough for someone that I forgot what enough even looked like for myself. I forgot what I wanted, what I dreamed about before I started dreaming around someone else's needs." He turned to face her fully, and the way he looked at her made her heart stumble over its own rhythm. "You're a restoration artist," he said, and there was something almost reverent in his tone. "You take broken, damaged, forgotten things and bring them back to themselves. You see what they were meant to be underneath all the damage and time and neglect. Maybe," his voice caught slightly, "maybe that's what we both need. Someone who can see past the damage to what's still there underneath." They moved closer without consciously deciding to, pulled together by something that felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. His hand came up slowly to her face, fingers brushing her cheek with a gentleness that made her eyes flutter closed. She could feel her pulse everywhere, in her throat, her wrists, behind her eyes. "Dominic," she started, but the word barely formed before her phone shattered the moment with the ringtone she knew too well, one she'd been meaning to change for months, but never had. Her stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. She shouldn't have answered. Every instinct screamed at her to let it go to voicemail, to stay in this moment on this terrace with this man who made her feel seen in ways she'd forgotten were possible. But 3 years is a hard habit to break, muscle memory written into her bones. So she stepped back inside the penthouse and put the phone to her ear with shaking hands. Hello? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Where are you? Marcus's voice was tight and controlled in that specific way that meant he was barely holding on to his temper. I've been trying to reach you. We need to talk about this, about what happened. You can't just what? She interrupted, and she heard a new edge in her own voice that she didn't quite recognize, something sharper than she'd ever allowed herself to be with him. Accept your breakup text? Respect your decision? Move on with my life? What exactly am I doing wrong now, Marcus? There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that used to make her rush to fill it with apologies or explanations or whatever he needed to hear. But tonight, she just waited. I never wanted this to happen, he finally said, and she could hear something in his voice that might have been regret, but sounded more like inconvenience. I was stressed, I panicked, but breaking up, that was extreme. We should talk about this face to face, like adults, instead of you running off to. You broke up with me through a text message, she said slowly, deliberately, like she was explaining something to a child, while I was sitting alone in a restaurant waiting for you. You didn't want to talk face to face then. You wanted the easy way out. That's not fair, Marcus protested. You're not being. I'm hanging up now. Don't call me again. She ended the call before he could respond, before her old habits could reassert themselves and make her apologize for having boundaries. When she turned around, Dominic was standing in the doorway between the terrace and the living room, giving her space, but somehow still present in a way that felt supportive rather than intrusive. I should go, she said. And this time she meant it. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. It's late. And this has been. Thank you for everything, for sitting down at my table, for making tonight something other than the worst night of my year, for seeing me when I felt invisible. He didn't argue or try to convince her to stay. Instead, he simply nodded and called his driver, then waited with her in comfortable silence that didn't demand anything from either of them. As she stepped into the elevator, he caught the door and said quietly, I meant what I said earlier, about him regretting it, about you being extraordinary. I couldn't find words adequate enough to respond, so I just nodded and let the doors close between them, watching him disappear as the elevator descended, wondering if I just imagined the entire impossible evening, or if it had actually happened. The next morning, there was a package waiting outside her apartment door when she left for work. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that probably cost more than the wrapping papers she'd bought in bulk at discount stores, was a book on Renaissance restoration techniques. But not just any book, a first edition, the kind museums kept in climate-controlled vault with security systems and gloves required for handling. The note tucked inside was written in confident handwriting on heavy cardstock. For someone who knows how to see beauty in broken things and has the patience to bring them back to themselves. Thank you for letting me be seen last night, not as what I'm supposed to be, but as who I actually am. D. She held that book against her chest in her tiny apartment hallway and let herself cry for the first time since reading Marcus's text. But these weren't the tears she'd been holding back in the restaurant. These were different, cleaner somehow, like something releasing instead of breaking. She went to work and threw herself into the piece she'd been restoring for weeks, a 17th century portrait of a woman whose eyes had been damaged by time and improper storage. All day, as she carefully worked to bring back the woman's gaze, she thought about Dominic's words, about being seen, about being enough exactly as she was. That evening, riding the subway home with tired hands and an exhausted mind, she made a mistake. She pulled out her phone and searched his name again, scrolling through recent images out of curiosity she should have resisted. And there she was in the third photo down, a woman with perfect blonde hair styled in waves that probably took hours and a smile that spoke of country clubs and trust funds, standing close beside Dominic at some charity gala. The caption identified her as longtime family friend Arabella Whitmore, rumored next step for the Vale Empire. She checked the date on the photo. 2 nights ago, the same night she'd been waiting at Celestine, or maybe even the night before. She couldn't tell which would be worse. If it was before her, suggesting she was just a distraction, or during her, suggesting she was just one of many. If you believe people should see your value even when you can't see it yourself, hit that subscribe button. People who make you feel small won't. And you need to hear what she discovered about her own strength. She tried to forget about the photo. She really did. Threw herself into her work at the museum, stayed late restoring paintings, avoided looking at her phone except for work emails. But then Marcus showed up during her lunch break 3 days later, walking past security like he still had the right to find her, like his name was still on some invisible list that granted him access to her space and her time. "We need to talk," he said, without preamble, cornering her near the storage vaults, where she'd been cataloging new acquisitions. His voice had that edge she remembered too well, the one that made everything feel like her fault. "People are saying things, asking me questions. Someone saw you at Celestine with Dominic Vale, and now there are rumors circulating, and I need to know what you think you're doing here." She stared at him like he was speaking a language she'd forgotten how to understand. "What I think I'm doing? You're making me look bad," he hissed, stepping closer in a way that used to make her step back, but this time made her hold her ground. "Like you moved on in 5 seconds. Like what we had for 3 years meant nothing to you. Like you were just waiting for an excuse to trade up to someone with more money." "You ended our relationship through a text message," she said slowly and deliberately, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "While I was sitting alone in a public restaurant waiting for you. And somehow I'm the one making you look bad?" "That's not the point," Marcus said, his face flushing. "The point is, you're embarrassed," she interrupted. "You thought I'd spend weeks crying over you. You thought I'd be devastated and alone and desperate to get you back. And instead, someone saw me having dinner with someone successful, and now your ego can't handle it?" "I made a mistake," he said, and his voice shifted into something that might have sounded like sincerity if she hadn't heard this exact tone before when he wanted something. "I panicked. I got scared of the commitment of what I was feeling, and I pushed you away because that felt safer than being vulnerable. But I want to fix this. I want us back. I want to try again and do it right this time." Before she could form a response, before she could tell him exactly how much she didn't care about what he wanted anymore, a voice she'd been trying not to think about echoed through the marble hallway. "I'm sorry, is this a private conversation, or can anyone interrupt terrible apologies that no one asked for?" Dominic walked toward them with a kind of easy confidence that made Marcus physically step backward without seeming to realize he was doing it. He was carrying wildflowers, not expensive roses from a florist, but actual wildflowers, like the ones that grew in the meadow behind the museum that she'd mentioned loving during one of their conversations that night. The fact that he'd remembered, that he'd listened to something so small and seemingly insignificant, made her throat tight. I thought I'd take you to lunch, Dominic said, his dark eyes on her face like Marcus wasn't even there. But I can see you're busy with. He finally looked at Marcus, his expression suggesting he was trying to play something deeply unimportant. I'm Marcus, Marcus said, drawing himself up to his full height and puffing out his chest like that might somehow matter. Her boyfriend. Well, we're working things out. We're getting back together. No, she said, finding her voice with a clarity that surprised her. He broke up with you via text message while you were sitting alone at a restaurant waiting for him. That's not someone who deserves a second chance. That's someone who deserves to watch you become everything he was too small-minded and self-centered to appreciate. Marcus's face went from flushed to deep red. Who the hell do you think you are to? I'm someone who sees her, Dominic said simply, cutting through Marcus's bluster like it was paper, which is apparently more than you managed to do in 3 years. People were gathering now, museum staff emerging from offices, visitors slowing their tours to watch, everyone drawn to the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. Marcus turned back to her, desperation replacing anger in his expression. You're really going to throw away 3 years for some rich guy who's slumming it? For someone who probably sees you as a charity case or a temporary distraction from his real life? Come on, be realistic here. And that's when something inside her that had been bending for 3 years finally snapped clean in half. You want to know what Dominic sees? She said, and her voice carried through the gallery with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He sees a restoration artist, someone with actual skill and passion and purpose, someone who does meaningful work that matters. You saw a hobby. You saw something cute to mention at your work parties when people asked what your girlfriend did. You saw someone small enough to fit beside you without ever casting a shadow that might make you look less impressive. She stepped closer to Marcus, and for the first time in 3 years, he was the one backing up. I spent 3 years making myself smaller for you, quieter, less ambitious, less passionate, less everything. I turned down opportunities because they might inconvenience you. I stopped talking about my work because you'd glaze over after 30 seconds. I made myself into whatever shape I thought you needed, and you still left me sitting alone in public because you were too much of a coward to face me like an adult. The gathered crowd was completely silent now, every eye on them. So, no, Marcus, I'm not throwing away 3 years. I'm reclaiming them. I'm taking back every piece of myself I made smaller for you, and I'm choosing to spend my time with someone who asks questions about my work instead of checking his phone while I answer. Someone who remembers the small things I mention in passing. Someone who shows up. Marcus looked around, finally realizing that everyone, staff, visitors, security, was watching him shrink in real time. His face cycled through emotions before landing on something like humiliation. He opened his mouth, closed it, then did what cowards always do when they're finally confronted with the consequences of their actions. He left, quickly, without another word, without even a backward glance. When the sound of his footsteps finally faded, she turned to Dominic, who was watching her with something like pride and admiration lighting up his dark eyes. Arabella Whitmore, she said, deciding to address the elephant she'd been carrying for 3 days. The woman in the photos from the gala, the one they're calling the next step for the Vale Empire, is my godmother's daughter, he finished without hesitation. and completely engaged to someone else. Has been for 2 years. The press likes to create stories about us because our families vacation together and we grew up as friends. But I haven't looked at anyone the way I look at you in years, maybe ever. He set the wildflowers carefully on a nearby marble bench and took both hands in his, right there in the middle of the museum gallery, with 24 witnesses watching like they'd stumbled into the finale of a movie. "I'm lonely," he admitted, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear despite their audience. "I have everything anyone could possibly want according to every measure society uses. Money, success, influence, property, opportunity, and I eat dinner alone most nights in a penthouse that echoes. I go to galas and business dinners and board meetings, and everyone sees Dominic Vale, CEO, billionaire, Forbes list, whatever label seems most relevant that day. But you," his voice caught slightly, and she watched him swallow hard before continuing. "You asked me what brought me to the restaurant. You asked what I did for fun, what I was passionate about beyond work. You asked questions like I was a person instead of a portfolio or a strategic connection. You saw me, and that's so rare I've forgotten what it felt like." She squeezed his hands, feeling the calluses on his palms that suggested he worked with his hands more than people probably assumed billionaire CEOs did. "I'm a museum restoration artist who lives in a studio apartment with terrible water pressure. I eat cereal for dinner at least 3 times a week. I buy my clothes on sale and save for months for a single dress. Your world is private jets and penthouses and women named Arabella who come from families like yours. How does this possibly work? How do we bridge that gap?" "However we want it to," he said simply. "We take it slow. We figure it out as we go. We both stop letting other people define what we deserve or what makes sense or what's supposed to happen next. We just exist together and see what that becomes." He pulled her closer, and this time nothing interrupted them. No phone calls, no business emergencies, no Marcus, no doubts. His lips met hers in the middle of a museum gallery surrounded by priceless art and priceless witnesses. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt like someone was choosing her, not the smaller version, not the quieter version, not the version that fit conveniently into someone else's life plan. Just her. When they broke apart, he was smiling in a way that made him look younger and less burdened. "So, lunch?" "Lunch," she agreed, unable to stop her own smile from spreading. "But somewhere with normal prices where the menu doesn't require a translation guide. And we split the check." "Deal," he said, taking her hand as they walked toward the exit, past the crowd of museum staff who were absolutely going to dissect this moment for months in the break room. "And I'm buying dessert, and that's non-negotiable." And as they stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving the museum and Marcus and her old life behind them, she realized something he'd said was actually true in a way he'd never intended. She had moved on in what looked like 5 seconds to everyone watching. But really, it had taken 3 years of making herself small to finally understand what it meant to be seen as large. 5 seconds to remember she'd never been broken, just unfinished, just waiting for someone who knew how to see what she was meant to be underneath all the damage and time and compromise. And maybe, just maybe, Dominic was unfinished too. Maybe they could figure out how to be complete, not because they needed each other, but because they chose each other. And that made all the difference.